Dragon Quest Monsters! It's finally back in the West after 10 years! And if you're looking for a Pokemon alternative that isn't Palworld, this might be the one. If you want to know more about what and why this franchise is, check out this video I already made. If you don't, well, it's Pokemon, except Dragon Quest. And it's better! Or is it? Keep on watching, stay subscribed, and maybe we'll figure that out together. So in Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince, you take on the role of Pizarro, half-human, half-monster prince of the Netherrealm. Your dad, Randolpho the Tyrant, is the king, but he totally sucks, so you are on a quest to finish him. But you're cursed to not be able to hurt other monsters yourself, leaving only one option. Wrangle some more and make them fight. Ethically. Probably. The whole story actually takes part alongside the events of Dragon Quest IV, but I haven't played that one, so convince me in the comments why I should, or tell me about how the retcons in this game desecrate an RPG classic, or elevate it. I literally don't know, I'm not quite an expert on proper Dragon Quest games. But I know a thing or two about Dragon Quest monsters, and the most important thing I know is that the monster taming itself is the best part of the game. See, in these kinds of creature collectors, usually you run into and recruit wild monsters in the overworld. And in Dragon Quest Monsters, you do that, but more importantly, you can synthesize monsters together into something way bigger and stronger and cooler looking. This isn't a game where you keep your starter with you forever and win with the power of friendship, but you might keep some shred of your early pal's spirit, stats, or skills even, as you're fighting with their great-grandchildren. And honestly, this makes the game so satisfying if you have a brain that is tickled by this sort of progression system, which I very much do. Imagine catching an Articuno in the wild and feeling like you've accomplished something. You cannot fathom the number of steps it took me to get this Prism Peacock. You actually have no idea. I think it literally took like 30 syntheses, but getting to fight with my favorite monster from my youth in 3 glorious, colorful dimensions was totally worth it. Although some of the more involved ones maybe weren't. I don't want to talk about what I had to do to get this thing. Thankfully, this game has a reverse search feature, which lets you see all of the potential monsters you can create by fusing the monsters in your farm already, saving you the trial and error of testing every combination manually. Now, I am an idiot and didn't figure out how this worked until I was already halfway through the game, but I still had a blast every time I stumbled into a new little rascal. There are even a few monsters that use a secret synthesis technique that reverse search doesn't really help with. So if you're someone who gets a kick out of having to consult the archaic texts, the Dark Prince has you covered there too. And there's even more to the process than just the species of monster. And thankfully, it's not all RNG like some other games. Every creature has a few traits or passive abilities, like getting to act multiple times, resisting a certain element, or the classic early game ability, several words that actually do nothing. And every beast has an innate talent too, which is a list of active and passive abilities to learn by leveling up. So a huge part of the process, and the game, is finding monsters with passive traits you like, and figuring out how to get the right talents on them through the breeding process to create something game-breaking. I don't know about you, but this makes me want to sit in front of a screen flicking an analog stick for like 20 hours without blinking. And I mean that seriously. The feeling I got when I was finally dropping Kaboomal for like 700 damage on every enemy was honestly better than I could have dreamed. So what do you actually do with these little time sinks? Well, it is a lot like Pokemon, although as I understand, Dragon Quest Monsters actually did a lot of the modern Pokemon mechanics first, like seeing monsters running around the overworld, stuff like that. The combat is super standard turn-based JRPG nonsense, which I don't think even needs an explanation beyond that. But the arena tournaments do keep the fun quirk of only allowing you to give your guys vague instructions and hoping they can make good decisions. And this time, I never even had an incident where they threw our championship in the trash, so it was pretty fun. And of course, there's a narrative guiding you through fighting your little fights. The story unfolds as you explore the underworld monster realm of Nadiria, which is separated into 6 major areas called circles. You come back to each circle 3 times over the course of the game, each time exploring a new area, and the difficulty ramps up with each visit as you'd expect. During each visit, you explore sort of an overworldy area for a bit before crawling your way through some sort of dungeon. And you might think this formula could wear thin pretty fast, but I'd say the locales were varied enough to hold my good favors. I mean, we're jumping from Shadow Moses Island to Candyland to super dark zone cult thing. There's definitely enough happening here. And the dungeons themselves were plenty unique, so I never really felt like I was trapped wading through a sea of cheap reskins. Actually, the dungeon design was one of my favorite things about this game. I'm someone who needs to collect every little trinket in an RPG area before I can move on because there are little worms that live in my brain. But at least like 90% of the time in Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince, whenever paths diverged, the first corridor you passed by was the one that led to a dead end and a treasure chest, and then the second was the actual way forward. Meaning you could just go check out anything you saw and not really risk having to backtrack for a missed treat, solving a major pet peeve of mine. Lots of the goodies are pretty inconsequential too, so just running forward at full speed doesn't kneecap you either. Some of the later dungeons maybe got a little too complex for their own good. It's pretty annoying to be solving Zelda-style puzzles while constantly dodging aggressive respawning enemies on the map, or not dodging and getting whisked into a random battle so you're all turned around once you get back to the map. I lost 10 minutes of my life to this more than once. But I think it's a fair trade-off because I appreciate that the dungeons themselves get harder along with the enemies. Classic JRPGs do have their quirks and flaws, and if you're willing to engage with them, you really gotta be willing to handle some of that. And then things always end with a boss fight, and more often than not, they actually felt perfectly scaled, so well done, Squeenix. Now, the actual story was a little bit hard for me to follow sometimes. I think this is because each circle of Nadiria has its own little side story running parallel to the game's main arc, or maybe it has something to do with the fact that after a certain point, I couldn't handle every goofy creature sounding like a dapper British lad.
I'll be rooting for ya!
There's just no way this thing sounds like that. And no shade to the voice actors, they did a great job. I was just personally a bit shaken by the broad decision to make everything so goofily Union-jacked.
You sneaky rotter.
But after I changed the voices to Japanese, whoa my god, we are along for a ride. And after this point, I was more into it, and the story started to pick up, and I actually enjoyed it a good bit. It's definitely often ridiculous, sometimes campy, and certainly not elegant, award-winning high art. But it's a pretty cool change of pace to have a JRPG focused on ugly revenge instead of normal, noble, good guy garbage. And there are actually some decently ambitious and dark twists and turns that surprised me here. I wouldn't recommend playing this for the story, but if you're already here, it's solid. All things told, I wrapped up the main story in 65 hours. And I probably could have easily closed it out in 24 hours less than that, but I really was in love with the grind. In between dungeons, sometimes I'd just fuse up a whole new team because I'd realized I could and I wanted some cool new guys. And I really think that is the particular appeal of Dragon Quest Monsters. If you're not here to chase those higher power levels and get off on synthesizing some lowly slime all the way into a divine dimensional dragon, you might just not get the most out of this game, because that really is the meat of the experience. The gameplay loop can get a little dreary or repetitive if that feeling isn't there for you. The post-game this time is unfortunately pretty thin, but even without anything left to do, I spent another 10 or 20 hours just synthesizing some more cool monsters. Even without content to use them on, I just really enjoyed the process. Maybe that's because I'm a Sixers fan. Hopefully I've given you some sense and slice of what this game is like, and you can now either decide that you've had enough or that you want to get lost in the sauce like me and play it yourself. This series is eternally near and dear to my heart, so I would love to see some success in the States so that sequels can continue getting localized, even if I'm not actually associated with Square Enix in any way. But they totally should pay me for this, right? I'm just saying, there's a stronger argument that Pokemon ripped off Dragon Quest Monsters than the reverse. Check out my last video for that. So between this and Palworld, you know where I'm at. Anyway, I'll be back soon with more cool stuff. Till then.